Over the last 3 weeks, we've been looking at Sabbath, this day that God has gifted to us, a day in which He invites us to stop, to rest, and to delight and worship. We've talked about what it means to stop, to lay aside the things we normally do during the week, our normal work week, lay aside a day in that. We've talked about what it means to rest, allowing God to restore us from the pressures and challenges of the last week. And last week we talked about finding delight in God and pleasure in the things that we enjoy. Today, we're focusing on what is perhaps the most important aspect of Sabbath, and that is worship. For most of us, Sunday is the day that we take as our Sabbath, the day that we kind of naturally associate with Sabbath as Christians. Throughout this message today, therefore, I'm going to be sort of using Sabbath and Sunday interchangeably to express the same thing, just so that you know as you hear there's different words being said as we go through this sermon this morning. Growing up in a Christian home meant that Sunday for me was all about church. The day would start with us kids, my sister and I, start with Sunday school. Glenda's dad drove the church bus, and he would pick my sister and me up from outside our house, take us into church in town. We lived on the outskirts of town, and there we would have Sunday school. I kind of enjoyed Sunday school as a kid. This is a small church, family church. Glenda's uncle was the Sunday school superintendent, kind of the ministry leader that we call it today of Sunday school. So we'd all start together as a pretty big Sunday school all together, and then we'd break into classes, and in those small classes we'd open up or have the Bible story explained to us. And that's the part that I really, really loved. Then after Sunday school, it would be church. And that wasn't as much fun for a kid. We had to sit quietly, very still, on a wooden pew. It was pretty uncomfortable, and listen to what I thought was a pretty boring preacher, at least when I was in primary school. It got better as I got older and probably as pastors changed. Then we'd go home for lunch, and in the evening, we would come back to church for the gospel service, which in my eyes was just more of the same. But after church in the morning, we would often or sometimes go after the evening service, we would sometimes go to someone's house, different people's houses, and we'd have a sing-along, singing gospel songs around a piano, or someone had a guitar. There were tambourines and all sorts of different instruments. That would be our evenings. If there are no kids there, my sister and I would sort of hide behind a chair or in the corner, and we'd play silently on our own and then drift to sleep and then be woken by mum and dad to take us home at night. Does anyone else have memories like that? See a few hands? I see a few nods as I was going through that, or smiles, probably reflecting on what it was like for you. Effectively, Sunday morning, noon, lunch, and evening was all about church. And if we weren't going to someone's house for lunch after the morning service, or some people weren't coming to our house for lunch, mum and dad would buy some fresh bread and take it home for lunch. One of the few, a milk bar was probably the few things that were open at that time. And then we'd go for a drive often. Go to the beach and get an ice cream. Wow, we get an ice cream at the beach again. Not many other things were open, so we got an ice cream. And that was it. It was Sabbath. It was a day to keep holy. Now fast forward to 2026. And Sunday has long since disappeared as a distinct day in the Australian calendar. Everything is open. And Sunday has become just another day of shopping and sport and entertainment and catching up with people. So what is your Sunday typically look like today? Let's wind it back to Saturday night. Let's start with Saturday night. Maybe you stay up a little bit later than normal. You party late into the night or into the early morning. Maybe you indulge a little more than what you probably should. And you wake up Sunday morning feeling like you're in a fog. Church is on. You decide to go to church. You rush out the door. Along the way, you grab a coffee to try and clear that morning brain fog. Or maybe you're at home and you sort of roll over, grab the phone, the iPad, sit up, turn on the live stream. After church, you might go out for lunch. You go home. You do some shopping. You might watch some sport on TV. Maybe you might go to the footy. Maybe you do some work around the house. Do some homework. Check your work emails. And then maybe at the end of the day, you sit down and watch a couple of episodes on Netflix and then head off to bed. Does that kind of sound like a typical Sunday? Now, I'm not judging you. Please don't hear me judging you this morning. I'm not trying to do that. I'm not trying to send you on a guilt trip if that is your typical Sunday. It's just an honest appraisal of what the weekend and particularly Sundays look for Christians in Australia today, where the average believer attends church 1.6 times a month. 1.6 times a month. But here's the thing. What I just described in that typical Australian Sunday for a Christian is not the Sabbath. It's what Eugene Peterson describes as an illegitimate offspring. He uses a different word for that. I've chosen not to use that word. An illegitimate offspring created by combining the ancient practice of Sabbath with the modern secular day off. We could call it Shabbish or Sabbath-ish. Let's go with Shabbish. A kind of Sabbath, I'm going to get this wrong now, a kind of Sabbath, but not really. It's a day of leisure with Sunday thrown in, or church thrown in, if we really want to, if we feel like it. Now, Jesus reminds us, and we've mentioned this throughout the series, that the Sabbath was not made for us. The Sabbath was made for man, not man. Sorry, I've got that around the wrong way. The Sabbath was made for us, not the Sabbath, not us for the Sabbath and keeping the Sabbath. It was made for us to stop, to rest. And if we're busy on Sunday as any other day in the week, it won't do us any good, physically or mentally. I invite you to open up your Bibles or your Bible app to Deuteronomy chapter 5. Deuteronomy is the fifth book in the Old Testament: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, number 5. And in Deuteronomy, Moses restates the law that God gave him that he writes about in Exodus, but gives it some more application and just fills it out a little bit differently in what it was in his earlier book. And those 10 commandments that we find in Exodus, we've read them before in this series in Exodus, are here in Deuteronomy chapter 5. We pick up the fourth commandment in verse 12, where Moses is writing, "Observe the Sabbath day by keeping it holy, as the Lord your God has commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or your daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your ox, your donkey, or any of your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns, so that your male and female servants may rest as you do. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out of there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, The Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day. So in the law God gave the Israelites through Moses, everybody had the seventh day off. The entire household, the family, the servants, the animals on their property, even foreigners living in the town were commanded to stop work and to keep the Sabbath. And there were 69 extra rules in the Torah, in the Old Testament, that constituted what work was for the Israelites. And heaps and heaps more were added much later by the Pharisees. Here are just a couple of those extra rules that the Jews in Jesus' day had to observe. The first, you couldn't spit on a Sabbath. Not because it was unhygienic, not because it was a health hazard, but because it would disturb the dirt. And therefore, you would be guilty of plowing the dirt. It gets worse. Walking through a grassy field was restricted. Why? Because as you're walking through this field, a little bit of seed might get stuck on your foot and get flicked off. You were technically guilty of harvesting or threshing the grain. And here's the biggest one of all, or the smallest one, it's a fly. You couldn't swat a fly on the Sabbath, because then you'd be guilty of hunting. Now, we might laugh at all this. There's a lot more. Google it. There's lots. And we might think, oh, that's pretty amusing. That's pretty funny. But if you were under that law, life was pretty difficult for a devout Jew. And we find in the New Testament, Jesus regularly came into conflict with these Pharisees and their ridiculous man-made rules. Remember the time that he and his disciples were hungry. They were walking through a field of wheat. Well, that's a no-no. But they actually stopped because they were so hungry, and they picked some of the ears off and started to eat them. Well, that was work. That was harvesting. And so they were reprimanded by the Pharisees for breaking the Sabbath. And then there's that time, I'm sure we know, when Jesus healed a man on the Sabbath. Healing was work. So again, Jesus was pulled up by the Pharisees for desecrating the Sabbath. Of course, Jesus responded so beautifully by saying it's better to do good things on the Sabbath than nothing at all. There was an element of this kind of legalism that defined many of our experiences in church growing up. But this Pharisaic approach of the Pharisees in the Bible, of people in generations previously, missed the point of what Sabbath is all about. The point is that the Sabbath, the Sunday for us as Christians, is set apart by God for our benefit, set apart by God for us to enjoy. An invitation to rest, an invitation to enjoy His presence. And it's a different day from Monday to Saturday. Even though we live in a 24/7 world where everything's going all the time and everything's open, life's as busy and frantic on Sunday as it is on every other day of the week. For Christians, this is a different day. So how do we find that balance between excessive legalism on one hand and Sunday just being a day of leisure, a day to do our own thing, what we want? How do we keep Sabbath from becoming shabbish? By remembering two things about Sabbath. Sabbath is holy, not just happy, and it's worship, not just weekend. say that again. Sabbath is holy, not just happy. It's worship, not just weekend. We've had this reading before, but let's go back to Genesis chapter 2, verses 2 to 3, where the writer says, by the seventh day Moses had finished the work he had been doing. On the seventh day God finished the work that he'd been doing. So on the seventh day he rested from all his work. Then God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done. So notice what God does on a Sabbath, on the Sabbath. He stops. He rests from all his work, not because he was worn out and tired from all his creation, but because he wanted to step back. He wanted to step back and stop and rest and enjoy this beauty that he had made, and enjoy it. And he makes this day holy. Holy in Hebrew is the word kadesh, which means consecrated, unique, special, uncommon. The theological definition is that it is set apart for God's purposes. In the Jewish Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, there are holy pots, there are holy pans, there are holy cooking utensils that are used in the tabernacle, in God's temple. But a fork or a spoon or a pot isn't good and evil in itself, but it can be set apart for God's purposes, or just used in everyday life. In our home, we have mismatched mugs for coffee and tea during the day, regular glasses that you buy at Kmart for $1, everyday plates to eat off. But when guests come over, we have good dinnerware. We have nice glassware. Instead of paper napkins, we have cloth napkins, I think usually. And then Christmas. Wow, Christmas. That's the silver cutlery that has to be polished before we use it. The table, the plateware is real china, fine china. Crystal glasses, not just run-of-the-mill glass. And that way, the tableware that we use for guests and for special occasions like Christmas are holy. They're set apart for special use. They're different from our regular tableware. Sabbath is a different day from the rest of the other days of the week. A holy day, a day set apart. Set apart for what? Or more correctly, set apart for whom? Let's look at verse 14 back in Deuteronomy chapter 5. I've got the wrong one there. Let's my typing is wrong. It should be verse 13. It starts off, 6 days you shall labor and do your work. And this is the verse 14. But the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. The seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. The New Living Translation translates that phrase, a Sabbath to the Lord, as a day of rest dedicated to the Lord. A day of rest dedicated to the Lord. The Sabbath is a day meant to be set aside for rest, for delight in God, celebration and enjoyment of the things that we enjoy, but especially for God. Sabbath is a day of worship. Now, when we hear the word worship, we automatically think of what we've done this morning, earlier in the service, singing praise and worship songs to God. Those are examples of worship. But worship is much more than that. Biblically, worship is to orientate or reorientate our entire lives around God. Around God, our Creator. God who is our center, our focus. It's a day to lay our lives before Jesus in love and deepen our surrender to God in every part of our life, not just on Sunday, but in every part of our life. One year, Glenda and I grew sunflowers in our backyard. This is not our backyard. These are not the sunflowers, and this is not my photo. Okay, got that out of the way. If you're familiar with sunflowers, you're probably aware that they tend to all face in the same direction. Peter or Chi-Chi will probably correct me if I'm wrong, but I understand sunflowers exhibit a behavior known as heliotropism. Sunflowers like to sunbathe. Young flowers track the movement of the sun throughout the day from east to west. And then when night starts to come, they go back to the east, waiting for the sun to rise the next day. As they mature and aren't as flexible and able to move as much as younger flowers, they stop moving and they just face east permanently, waiting for that sun to rise the next day. Worship is like that. It's orienting our lives towards God again and again, staying connected to Him, focusing our attention on God, centering our minds on God's character and His action in the world. It's about making space for God in our lives and in our day. Of course, on a Sunday, here at church, we worship through singing and participating in services like this, but there are many other ways to do that as well. Yielding our decisions, our schedules, our lives to Jesus is worship too. Anything that we do to center God and direct our hearts towards His glory, His goodness, His love is worship. Sabbath is a day to stop. Stop what you're doing normally through the week. Rest, take a break, delight in the good things God gives us. But if we stop there, just with resting and delighting, as Sean mentioned last week, we miss the point of Sabbath, which is above all to contemplate our Creator, to contemplate what God has done for us through Jesus. Sabbath is an opportunity to deepen our communion with the deepest reality of the universe. It's what we describe as abiding in Christ. Worship of God is the most important movement of Sabbath practice. For me, Sabbath begins with stopping, shutting down my computer, turning or trying to turn my mind off work, and then I begin delight. This week, Glenda and I did something that's suggested in the resources that we have available for you to take after each service. We started our Sabbath, which for me is on Friday, so we do Friday together. We started on Thursday night with a special dinner. Nice plates, this is the holy plates. Nice plates, crystal glasses, candles burning, which we have that fairly regularly, but that was a special one that night. And a delicious roast, followed by an equally delicious apple dumpling pudding. Next day in the morning, on Friday morning, we drove into Healesville Sanctuary and enjoyed a coffee, and then a couple of hours walking among the birds. These are my photos. The birds, the animals, and the dinosaurs. You know there are dinosaurs in Healesville? Life-size. Some kids thought they were. They got really scared. Life-size dinosaurs that they don't move their feet, but they move their bodies. They growl at you. They roar. They're incredible. I think they're till the end of the month. Oh, that's today. Oh, no, I think it's next month. Yeah, okay, so you've still got time to go and see them. But as we walked around Healesville, I love Healesville. I think it's probably the best zoo out of the three that we have here. As we moved throughout there, as we spent time in the bird aviary, as we watched the bird flying, what do they call that? activity, owls coming right past us like this, I started to delight in the day and God's incredible creation. As I did that, my heart became full of worship, became full of gratitude and wonder and awe at the goodness, the majesty, the creative ability and power of God. Ruth Harley Barton, in her book Sacred Rhythm, writes about her experience. It's a bit small, maybe. Her experience of Sabbath. I know what it's like to rest for hours until I have the energy to delight in something. Good food, a good book, a leisurely walk, a long-awaited conversation with someone I love. I know what it feels like to feel joy and hope and peace flow back into my body and soul, though I thought it might never come again. I know what it's like to see my home and my children through the Sabbath eyes of enjoyment. I know what it's like to have rest turn into delight, and delight turn into gratitude, and gratitude into worship. Does Sunday feel like that for you? Sabbath. It's a holy, not just happy day. It's worship, not just weekend. The tragic way Sunday has been co-opted by the weekend from a day of worship to merely just a day off gets to the heart of the matter. Sabbath is holy, but we have to keep it holy. It's uncommon. It's not the norm of our culture, of our society. It's countercultural. And we face constant pressures from every side to go with the culture. The Jews don't talk about practicing Sabbath as much as keeping the Sabbath, keeping it holy. They call it sanctifying the day or setting apart the day, treating it as something special and something unique. So we can either sanctify the Sabbath and keep it holy, or we can desecrate it, which the Pharisees falsely accused Jesus of doing. In other words, we can honor it as a gift set apart for God, or we can treat it like any other day in the week, filling it in with our own plans, our own desires, our own interests, and forgetting the one who gave this gift to us. Now again, please don't feel guilt-shamed what I'm saying here. If we have put our trust in Jesus, the degree to which we keep the Sabbath or not is not going to change our status with God, our status for eternity. Ultimately, this is about a day and what you do with this day that God has given us. It's about how you live your life. And we need to remember that all the spiritual practices, and we'll go through more of those in the coming months, all the spiritual practices are means to an end. Sabbath is a day of worship by which we cultivate a spirit of worship for the rest of our lives. Practicing the Sabbath is designed to lead us into deeper worship with God so that our entire lives become more holy. It's what the Apostle Paul is describing in Romans 12. Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Do not conform to the pattern of the world. Even Paul knew that was happening in his culture as well. One of the biggest challenges in Sabbath is figuring out how to do it well in the various seasons of our life. And I've heard people share this with me and heard this over the last few weeks as we've been going through this series. I've heard people say, it's hard. How do you set aside 24 hours? I know that that's hard. I'm still trying to figure that out myself. As I've said, Glenda and I do our Sabbath on Friday. And then we kind of do a Sabbath-type things again on Sunday. We come to church. We worship together. Different seasons of life bring different changes and different challenges. Those who are single have different challenges from those who are parents of young children. And those challenges will be different again for people who are retired or an empty nesters. Every season of life has different challenges to finding rest and fully trusting and worshiping God. It's often been said that going to church on a Sunday is a little bit like filling up your car with petrol, or today would say charging up your batteries for your journey going forward. Has anyone ever run out of petrol or your battery? You don't need a show of hands. I don't want to embarrass anybody. I've been close once with the caravan on the back. It was getting dark and I was frantic until we finally found a diesel pump. But once it gets to quarter on that gauge, I'm looking around for the nearest petrol station. I don't like getting much below quarter. I used to work with a guy. He was an accountant, so you think he'd know better, who ran his car until it was just about empty. He must have worked out how long it should be, but didn't gauge it very well. He often ran out of petrol, including on the Balti Bridge. And that can be like us if we don't spend time in worship on the Sabbath. If we don't come to a place of worship or listen online or have fellowship with other believers, then we tend to run out of petrol. We run out of battery. And over the years, I've seen people, many of them, my friends and family members, forget the importance of making church a priority on Sunday. They start attending 3 out of 4 weeks, and then it becomes every second week, and then it's once a month, and then it's just on special days. And over time, without even realizing it, our hearts can slowly drift. For some people, I know it's more difficult to be here every week or even every second week or every 3 weeks. They come when they can, and I get that. But the important thing is that we try. We try and gather together whenever possible and worship with others on Sabbath, on Sunday. An important part, the most important part of Sabbath is worshiping the living God, worshiping with others as we're doing this morning. Listening if we can't come to the service online or listen to Christian music, podcasts, reading a Christian book. Sabbath, on that day, we transition from a life of anxious concern to a life of increasingly yielding ourselves in trust to God. For 6 days of the week, we do our best to hold everything together, managing our households, managing our lives at work, our energy being given to all of that sort of stuff. We manage our phone notifications, our email bings, our calendars, our lists, our households. But for one day on the Sabbath, we can say, God, thank you for this gift of Sabbath. I want to be with you and with those you've entrusted me with. Fill my day with rest and delight. But most of all, God, fill me with you. Fill my day with you. All week long, the false gods of this world will try and pull us out of orbit with God into a downward gravitational pull. It's invisible. We don't see it, but it is powerful. And those gods promise rest, they promise joy, they promise happiness, community, identity. Yet all they give us is weariness and emptiness of soul, something the Western world has perfected. Sabbath is a day to fill our tanks, the tanks of our soul, with the only thing that can truly fill us: worship of the living God of the universe. Sabbath is holy, not happy. It's worship, not just weekend. For those of us who belong to Jesus, Sabbath becomes a returning to our true center. Our spirit communes with God's Spirit, and we are drawn together, drawn again into the life and the love of God himself. That is worship on a Sabbath. Theologians point out that the Sabbath looks both backwards and forwards. Looks back into a taste or an aftertaste, maybe if you like, of the Garden of Eden, and then a foretaste of the new Jerusalem, the new creation. A reminder of where we've come from, a glimpse of where we're going, and an invitation to be with God here and now. And my prayer for us as a church is not that we would simply admire this idea of Sabbath, but that we would receive it as God's gift to us. May we become people who know how to stop, to rest, to delight, and worship on our Sabbath, on our Sunday. People who are attentive to God's beauty, God's goodness, God's kindness, and God's presence. People whose lives are being reoriented towards Jesus. Let's pray.